Inside the rock cavern, the fire burned steadily, offering a haven of warmth against the elements. Outside, a furious wind howled at 40 miles per hour, driving the temperature down to a brutal 20 degrees below zero. Owen Harlan stood at the carved entrance, watching the Fletchers sleep peacefully near the glowing hearth. Their child, wrapped snugly in blankets, was alive thanks to Owen's 8 months of relentless work, chiseling a home into solid mountain stone, a feat everyone had deemed impossible. If you've ever wondered how people managed to survive the harshest winters before the advent of modern heating, be sure to subscribe, because this story unveils a life-saving technique from the deadliest blizzard in Appalachian history. The winter of 1883 descended early upon the mountains of eastern Kentucky, and its icy grip refused to loosen. By late November, a layer of frost coated the ground each morning, lingering until midday. December brought a relentless freeze that never thawed. Owen Harlan awoke each morning in the cabin he shared with Isaac Monroe, finding delicate ice crystals clinging to the interior walls near the ceiling, a testament to their frozen breath during the night. The fire in their stone hearth burned without ceasing, consuming wood at an alarming rate that concerned both men. They had erected the cabin 3 years prior, employing techniques Owen's father had passed down in Virginia, logs carefully notched at the corners, chinked with clay and moss for insulation, a sturdy door, a single window covered with oiled paper to let in light, and a fieldstone fireplace designed for efficient smoke removal. The structure was typical of Appalachian mountain cabins, intended to provide basic shelter from rain and moderate cold. However, this winter pushed their limits far beyond anything they had previously experienced. Owen dedicated his days to the arduous task of cutting firewood. He would venture out at first light, laboring until his hands grew numb despite the protection of heavy gloves, then return to the fire for a brief respite before heading back out for another load. Isaac, 15 years older and less suited to the physical demands, tended the fire and managed their small trapline. They were primarily hunters, relying on the sale of pelts and dried meat to settlements in the valleys below. The isolation suited them both. Owen, at 28, had sought refuge in the mountains to escape the crowded settlements of the Piedmont. Isaac had resided in these hills for 2 decades, preferring the solitude to the constraints of society. The oppressive cold became the defining aspect of their existence. Every action revolved around the pursuit of warmth. Meals were eaten close to the fire. They slept layered in blankets and furs on raised platforms, trying to escape the chill radiating from the dirt floor. Rags were stuffed around the door frame and window edges in an attempt to block drafts. Despite their best efforts, the cabin remained barely habitable. The fire effectively heated a radius of perhaps 8 feet. Beyond that, the temperature plummeted rapidly. The corners of the cabin remained perpetually frigid, and frost formed on the interior walls each night. Owen began to notice troubling details. The chinking between the logs contracted in the extreme cold, creating hairline gaps that allowed frigid air to seep in. The door, despite its apparent solidity, allowed wind to penetrate around its edges. The stone fireplace, though well-built and efficient, still lost most of its heat up the chimney. Heat naturally rose, and their design captured only a fraction of it before it escaped into the atmosphere. The cabin devoured enormous quantities of wood just to maintain a minimal level of comfort. Isaac accepted these conditions as simply the inevitable cost of a mountain winter. He had endured previous harsh winters and expected to survive this one as well. Owen, however, found himself unable to accept this explanation. Something about the inefficiency deeply bothered him. They were working ceaselessly just to stay marginally warm. There had to be a better way. On the night of January 9, 1884, the temperature plummeted to unprecedented levels. Owen awoke sometime after midnight to darkness and bitter cold. The fire had dwindled to mere embers. He could see his breath in thick clouds, illuminated by the faint moonlight filtering through the window. He sat up, disoriented, and realized Isaac had been responsible for tending the fire through the night. Owen called out his partner's name, but no response came from the sleeping platform across the cabin. Owen forced himself from beneath his blankets and made his way to the fireplace. His hands trembled violently as he added kindling to the embers and blew carefully until flames began to catch. The fire grew slowly, pushing back the darkness. With light restored, Owen turned to check on Isaac and found his partner motionless on the sleeping platform, covered in frost. Isaac Monroe was dead. The cold had claimed him in his sleep. Owen would later piece together the events of that fateful night. Isaac had maintained the fire until late, but had fallen asleep before adding enough wood to last until dawn. The fire consumed its fuel and died. The temperature inside the cabin plummeted rapidly once the heat source was extinguished. Isaac, exhausted from days of inadequate sleep and the constant stress of the cold, never woke. The cold simply stopped his heart. Owen sat beside Isaac's lifeless body as dawn broke, unable to fully comprehend what had transpired. They had survived encounters with grizzlies, harsh summers, scarce game, and countless other challenges. Death by cold inside their own cabin seemed an impossible paradox. Yet, the evidence was undeniable. The shelter they had trusted had failed in the most fundamental way possible. He spent that day preparing Isaac's body and the next 2 days digging a grave on a hillside overlooking the creek where they had trapped beaver for 3 seasons. The ground was frozen 18 inches deep. Owen had to build fires on the grave site to thaw the earth before he could begin digging. He marked the grave with stacked stones and stood in the cold wind, searching for words that seemed adequate. None came. He returned to the cabin alone. The structure felt different now. Owen saw it clearly for the first time as what it truly was, a temporary barrier against the elements, adequate in moderate conditions but catastrophically flawed when tested by genuine cold. The walls were too thin, the gaps too numerous, and the heating method too inefficient. Every cabin in these mountains shared the same fundamental weaknesses. Men simply accepted the risk and hoped they would survive each winter. Owen could no longer accept that. Isaac's death had revealed a truth he could not ignore. The traditional approach to mountain shelter was inadequate. Cabins fought the cold through constant fuel consumption, yet still lost the battle when temperatures became extreme. There had to be another way, a method that did not rely on burning endless wood just to maintain a marginal level of warmth, a shelter that worked with natural principles instead of constantly fighting against them. That night, Owen lay awake in the cabin, listening to the wind whistling through the gaps in the chinking. His mind turned obsessively to a single question. How do you build a shelter that stays warm without a constant fire? Owen spent the following weeks completing the necessary winter tasks alone. He checked trap lines, processed pelts, and maintained an adequate firewood supply. But his thoughts remained focused on the problem of shelter and heat. He began studying his cabin with renewed intensity, identifying every point where warmth escaped, the gaps between logs, the door frame, the window, the chimney that relentlessly pulled heated air upward and expelled it into the sky. The entire structure was designed to leak. He visited neighboring cabins under the pretense of trading supplies and checking on families during the harsh winter. Each structure revealed the same pattern. Caleb Drummond's cabin, 3 miles south, had better chinking than Owen's, but suffered worse drafts around the door. The Hastings family, 5 miles east, had built their cabin into a hillside for wind protection but still burned wood constantly to maintain a barely tolerable warmth. Everyone accepted these conditions as an unchangeable reality. Owen asked questions that others found strange. How much wood did they burn per day? How cold did their cabins get overnight? Had they noticed temperature differences between areas near the walls versus the cabin center? Most people answered politely, but clearly thought that grief had affected his thinking. Caleb told him directly that mountain winters were simply hard, and no amount of clever building could change that fundamental truth. But Owen had begun to notice something others overlooked. Natural caves maintain steady temperatures regardless of outside conditions. He had sheltered in shallow rock overhangs during hunting trips and noticed that they felt warmer than the open air, even without fires. One particular cave stood out in his memory, a deep crack in a limestone cliff where he had waited out a thunderstorm the previous summer. Inside, just 15 feet from the entrance, the air had been noticeably cool despite the summer heat outside. In late February, Owen hiked to that cave specifically to test his theory. The journey took most of a day, through snow that remained knee-deep in shaded areas. He found the cave entrance, partially blocked by ice, but still accessible. He crawled inside and moved back into the darkness until daylight became a distant glow behind him. The temperature change was immediate and dramatic. Outside, the air was bitterly cold with a wind that cut through his heavy coat. Inside the cave, 30 feet from the entrance, the air was still and noticeably warmer. Not warm in any absolute sense, but significantly less cold than the surface. Owen sat in that darkness for an hour, contemplating the fact that the rock around him held a temperature that the outside air did not. Stone had mass and substance that would lack. It absorbed and retained heat or cold from deeper within the earth, where temperatures remained constant. A cave stayed cool in summer and warm in winter, relative to surface conditions, because it was connected to that deep, stable temperature. The question formed clearly for the first time. What if he did not build on top of the ground, but instead went into it? Not a cave exactly, but something deliberately carved, a shelter made from stone instead of wood, a space that utilized the Earth's own temperature instead of fighting it. Owen returned to his cabin with a plan that he knew would sound insane to anyone he told. He would carve a living space directly into solid rock. Not a shallow cave or dugout shelter, but a proper room excavated from mountain stone. The idea violated everything mountain people understood about building. Cabins could be constructed in days. Carving rock would take months. Wood was abundant and easy to work. Stone required tools that broke and effort that exhausted. No one carved homes from solid cliff faces because the work seemed impossible. But Owen could not abandon the logic. Rock held temperature. Rock blocked wind completely. Rock required no chinking, no maintenance, no constant adjustments. A space carved into stone would be thermally connected to the stable temperature deep within the mountain. Fire heat would be absorbed by the rock walls and radiated back instead of being lost through gaps and chimneys. The more he considered it, the more certain he became. He spent 2 weeks in early March scouting locations. He needed a cliff face with the right characteristics, south-facing for maximum sun exposure at the entrance, solid stone without major cracks or fracture lines that would make carving dangerous, located near water but above the potential for flooding, high enough to avoid the cold air that settled in the valleys, yet accessible enough to haul supplies. He found the ideal site on a ridge overlooking a creek tributary, a limestone cliff approximately 40 feet high with a vertical face that appeared solid and uniform. Owen began work on March 20th, 1884. His tools were simple: a heavy hammer, 3 iron chisels of varying sizes, a pry bar, and a determination born from witnessing his partner freeze to death. He started at eye level, chipping away at the stone face to create a horizontal cut. Limestone was softer than granite, but still required tremendous effort. Each hammer blow sent vibrations through his arms. Progress was measured in inches per day. Caleb Drummond visited in early April and found Owen covered in stone dust, hammering away at the cliff face. Caleb watched for several minutes before speaking. He asked what Owen was doing. Owen explained that he was carving a shelter into the rock. Caleb stared at him, then asked how long Owen thought that would take. Owen admitted that he did not know exactly, months certainly. Caleb shook his head and said, "A man could build 3 cabins in the time it would take to carve a room from solid stone." Owen agreed that was probably true. Caleb asked why anyone would waste effort on such foolishness. Owen said because rock does not burn wood to stay warm. Caleb left, convinced that grief and isolation had damaged Owen's mind. Word spread through the scattered mountain community. Owen Harlan was carving a cave like some kind of animal, wasting his time on stone when perfectly good trees surrounded him. People began avoiding his ridge, not wanting to witness the embarrassing spectacle of a man engaged in pointless labor. Owen continued working, indifferent to their opinions. The work consumed Owen completely. He developed a rhythm that governed his days from April through November of 1884. Wake before dawn, eat a cold breakfast of cornmeal and dried meat, work the stone until his hands could no longer grip the tools, rest briefly, then return to hammering until darkness made precision impossible. His body adapted to demands he had never placed on it before. His hands developed calluses upon calluses. His shoulders and back grew stronger from the constant overhead hammering required to carve the ceiling sections. His technique evolved through necessity and observation. Owen learned that limestone fractured along natural planes if he could identify them. Hours spent studying the rock face revealed subtle lines where ancient sediment layers had compressed differently. He could place his chisel on these lines and split away larger sections with less effort than trying to pulverize solid stone. But finding these planes required patience and attention that tested him constantly. He carved the entrance first, creating an opening 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall. The dimensions were deliberate, wide enough to move supplies through but narrow enough to minimize heat loss, tall enough to enter upright but low enough that the opening represented a small percentage of the eventual interior volume. He angled the entrance slightly downward, carving into the cliff at a 5-degree decline. This created a natural cold air trap. Heavy cold air would sink and flow out, while warm air would rise and remain trapped deeper within the carved space. The interior chamber took shape slowly through summer and into fall. Owen carved a room 12 feet wide, 16 feet deep, and 7 feet tall at the center. The dimensions were limited by his ability to remove broken stone. Everything he chiseled free had to be carried out through the entrance. Larger rooms would require moving proportionally more material. He settled on a size that would provide adequate living space while remaining achievable for one man working alone. Debris removal became a challenge in itself. Owen estimated that he moved approximately 8 tons of broken limestone during the excavation. He carried it out in a canvas sack, dumping each load down the hillside below the cliff. The pile of rubble grew into a significant mound that visibly marked his progress. Neighbors who saw it from a distance used it to track how much stone Owen had removed, shaking their heads at the wasted effort. Tool maintenance consumed a significant amount of time. Chisels dulled quickly against the stone. Owen had to reheat and reshape the cutting edges every few days using a small forge he built near the worksite. He learned to recognize when a chisel was about to break and retire it before the metal shattered and rendered the entire tool useless. He broke 11 chisels during the excavation and wore out 2 hammer handles from constant use. By September, the basic chamber was complete. Owen stood inside the carved space, 40 feet into solid mountain stone, and felt the temperature difference immediately. Outside, the autumn air was cool. Inside, the rock held the warmth of summer. The carved chamber was complete, but not yet habitable. Owen faced the critical problem that had plagued many attempts at underground shelter throughout history: smoke. A fire inside the sealed rock room would quickly fill the space with choking fumes and make breathing impossible. Traditional caves either had natural chimneys created by vertical cracks in the stone, or they remained unusable for long-term habitation. Owen needed to create ventilation that allowed smoke to escape while preventing heat from following it out. He studied the rock ceiling for 2 weeks before beginning the ventilation work. The limestone above his carved chamber varied in thickness. In some areas, the stone extended 20 feet to the surface. In others, particularly near the back of the chamber, the distance was closer to 12 feet. Owen selected 3 locations where the stone was thinnest and began carving vertical channels upward. The work was brutally difficult. He had to chisel upward against gravity, standing on a platform he built from logs, reaching overhead to hammer at stone he could barely see in the dim light. Stone chips fell constantly into his face and eyes. Progress slowed to inches per week. Each ventilation channel was 6 inches in diameter, wide enough to draw smoke but narrow enough to create a natural draft without pulling excessive heat. The first channel broke through to the surface after 5 weeks of upward carving. Owen was inside the chamber when suddenly daylight appeared as a small bright spot in the ceiling. Fresh air flowed down immediately, drawn by the temperature difference between the warm interior and the cool exterior. He had successfully connected his carved space to the outside world through a controlled opening. He completed the second and third ventilation channels over the following month. The 3 openings created a circulation pattern that proved remarkably effective. Smoke from a fire would rise naturally, drawn toward the ceiling, and exit through whichever channel provided the easiest path based on wind direction outside. Fresh air entered through the entrance, creating a slow, continuous flow that prevented smoke accumulation while maintaining the warm air mass in the lower portions of the chamber. Owen built his hearth with equal care. Most cabins placed fires in corners or against walls. Owen positioned his fire ring in the center of the chamber, 8 feet from the entrance. The location was strategic. Heat would radiate outward in all directions, warming the rock walls, floor, and ceiling uniformly. The rock itself would absorb that heat and hold it long after the fire diminished. He constructed the hearth from flat stones arranged in a circle 2 feet in diameter. No mortar or clay, just carefully selected rocks that fit together tightly. He surrounded the fire ring with a raised stone lip that would contain coals and prevent them from spreading across the floor. Above the hearth, smoke would rise naturally toward the ventilation channels in the ceiling. Owen lit the first fire inside his carved chamber on October 12, 1884. The smoke drew upward cleanly and exited through the ventilation channels as designed. Owen moved into the carved cavern in late October. As the first serious cold of autumn settled over the mountains, he brought minimal supplies, a sleeping platform constructed from split planks, blankets and furs from his trap lines, cooking equipment, dried food stores, and his remaining tools. The entrance remained open, protected only by a canvas tarp he could drop for privacy or weather protection. He had not yet built a proper door, wanting first to test whether the carved space functioned as he believed it would. The first night revealed the fundamental difference between his stone shelter and any wooden cabin. Owen built a modest fire in the center hearth as temperatures outside dropped toward freezing. He kept the fire burning for approximately 3 hours while he prepared his sleeping area and organized his supplies. Then he let the flames die to coals and eventually go out completely. He wanted to see what happened when the heat source was removed. In a cabin, the temperature would drop rapidly once the fire died. Within an hour, the interior would match the exterior cold. Owen lay on a sleeping platform, wrapped in a single blanket, and waited. An hour passed. The air remained comfortable. 2 hours, still warm enough that he did not need additional covering. 3 hours after the fire had gone completely cold, the chamber retained enough heat that Owen slept through the night without discomfort. He woke before dawn and immediately noticed the temperature. The air was cool but not cold. His breath did not form clouds as it would inside a cabin. The rock walls, when he placed his hand against them, felt warm to the touch. They had absorbed heat from the fire and were now radiating it back into the space. The thermal mass he had theorized about was functioning exactly as he had hoped. Over the following weeks, Owen refined his understanding of the system. A fire burned for 2 hours in the evening would keep the chamber comfortable throughout the entire night and into the next morning. The rock continued radiating stored heat for 10 to 12 hours after the flames died. This meant that Owen needed perhaps 1/5 of the firewood that a cabin required. The efficiency was remarkable and undeniable. The ventilation channels worked even better than expected. Smoke exited cleanly without creating drafts that pulled heat away. The narrow diameter of each channel created enough restriction that air moved slowly, carrying smoke out, but not creating the rapid convection that made cabin chimneys waste heat. Cold air entering through the entrance remained low, sinking to the floor near the opening, while warm air stayed suspended in the upper portions of the chamber and the back areas farthest from outside exposure. By mid-November, Owen had proven his concept completely. The carved stone shelter maintained comfortable temperatures with minimal fuel consumption. The rock walls eliminated all drafts and wind penetration. The system worked not by fighting the cold, but by using the mountain's own thermal mass as a storage battery for fire heat. He began planning the final improvements that would make the space secure and weatherproof before winter arrived in full force. Owen completed his door in early December. He had learned from the failures of cabins and designed something that would seal completely. Heavy planks cut from oak and fitted together with iron brackets he had traded for in the nearest settlement. The door hung on iron hinges mortised directly into the rock entrance frame. He had carved recesses for the hinges while excavating, planning for this moment months in advance. A wooden beam slid across the interior into brackets, locking the door firmly against the stone itself. When sealed, no gap existed where wind could penetrate. Winter arrived with normal cold temperatures, Throughout December, Owen lived comfortably in his carved shelter, burning small fires each evening and watching the rock walls store and release heat with predictable efficiency. He ventured out to check trap lines and hunt when weather permitted. The pile of firewood he had prepared was barely diminished. In a cabin, he would have consumed 3 times that amount by this point in the winter. Caleb Drummond visited in late December and accepted Owen's invitation to see the interior. Caleb had continued to mock the project publicly, but curiosity had apparently overcome his skepticism. He entered the carved chamber and stood silently, looking at the rock walls, the central hearth, the sleeping platform, and the supplies organized on stone shelves that Owen had carved into the walls. The temperature inside was noticeably warmer than outside, despite only a small fire burning. Caleb asked how much would Owen burn daily. Owen told him, 2 hours of fire each evening. Caleb nodded slowly and left without further comment. January of 1885 began cold, but nothing unusual for the mountains. Then, on January 8th, the sky changed. Owen noticed it at dawn. The color was wrong. Not blue or gray, but a peculiar white that extended from horizon to horizon. The air was utterly still. No wind. The silence was absolute, broken only by the strange, oppressive stillness and the eerie pallor of the sky. By noon, a noticeable chill had permeated the air, and as evening approached, snow began to fall. This was not the typical mountain snow, with its fleeting flurries, but rather a heavy, dense snowfall, the flakes plummeting straight down in the windless void. Owen secured his door and stoked a generous fire, peering through a narrow opening as the snow piled up outside. It continued its relentless descent throughout the night, and by daybreak, the ground was buried under 3 feet of snow, with no sign of cessation. For 2 full days, the snow persisted, accumulating to depths of 5, then 6 feet outside Owen's entrance. He was forced to shovel a path simply to reach his woodpile, which he had strategically placed under a rocky overhang near the entrance. The temperature continued to plummet, reaching levels of cold unlike anything Owen had previously encountered, though he lacked a thermometer to measure it precisely. On the 3rd day, the wind finally arrived, roaring in from the north with a sound like unending thunder. It whipped the fallen snow into a frenzy, creating whiteout conditions where visibility was reduced to mere arm's length. The temperature plunged even further. Owen remained inside his carved chamber, listening to the wind's furious screams, muted by 40 feet of solid rock but still audible as a distant, persistent roar. Inside, the temperature remained surprisingly comfortable. He had burned a fire for 3 hours the previous evening, and the rock walls continued to radiate the stored heat, maintaining an estimated interior temperature of roughly 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the wind chill had dropped to levels that would prove fatal to an exposed person in mere minutes. On the 4th day of the blizzard, Owen detected an unusual sound amidst the howling wind, voices shouting. He opened his door to find himself confronted by a wall of snow that had drifted against the entrance. After digging through it, he emerged into the blinding chaos of the storm. He saw 3 figures struggling towards his cliff face: Robert Fletcher, his wife Sarah, and their daughter, who appeared to be about 6 years old. All 3 were covered in snow and ice, moving with the slow, disoriented steps of people nearing the limits of their endurance. Owen seized Robert's arm and pulled him towards the entrance. Sarah followed, carrying their child. Owen ushered them through the door and quickly sealed it behind them. Inside, the sudden absence of wind and the relative warmth induced a visible shock. Sarah collapsed to her knees, still clutching her daughter. Robert stood swaying, unable to speak coherently. Owen moved them near the fire ring and built up the flames. He wrapped blankets around them and heated water for them to drink. Gradually, they recovered enough to explain their predicament. They had been traveling to visit Sarah's family in a settlement 2 valleys away when the storm overtook them. Their horse had succumbed to the cold, forcing them to abandon their supplies and seek shelter. Robert remembered Owen's ridge from a previous journey and, knowing it was their only hope, had desperately aimed for it. The child, Emma, had stopped shivering. Her lips were blue and her responses sluggish, all clear signs of dangerous cold exposure. Owen placed her closest to the fire and wrapped her in every fur he possessed. Sarah held her daughter and wept softly. Robert sat with his head in his hands, too exhausted to do anything more than breathe. Over the next few hours, the warmth from the rock walls and the fire gradually brought all three back to full consciousness. Emma's color returned, and Sarah stopped trembling. Robert finally spoke clearly, inquiring as to how Owen's shelter remained so warm. Owen explained the carved chamber and the principle of thermal mass. Robert listened, shaking his head slowly, and recounted how he had heard people mock Owen for wasting his time on such foolishness. The blizzard raged on for 3 more days. Owen shared his food supplies and maintained the fire on a regular basis. The Fletchers slept on his platform while he made do with blankets on the stone floor. The chamber, originally designed for 1, comfortably accommodated 4. The rock continued to absorb and radiate heat with the same unwavering efficiency. On the 6th day, the wind finally ceased. The temperature remained brutally cold, but the immediate danger had passed. The snow lay 8 feet deep in drifts when Owen and Robert dug a path from the entrance on the 7th day after the storm began. The landscape had been utterly transformed, rendered almost unrecognizable. Trees were buried up to their upper branches, and the creek had frozen solid. Everything was white and still under a sky that had finally cleared to a brilliant blue. The cold remained so intense that exposed skin would freeze within minutes. Robert left first to check on his family's original destination and assess the damage throughout the region. He returned 2 days later with news confirming Owen's suspicions. The blizzard had claimed lives. Caleb Drummond had survived, but his cabin had become so cold that ice formed on the interior walls. The Hastings family had burned their furniture to keep their fire going and had still barely managed to maintain survivable temperatures. An elderly trapper named Warren had frozen to death in his cabin after his wood supply ran out. Robert made sure to tell everyone he encountered about Owen's carved shelter and how it had saved his family. The stories spread rapidly through the scattered mountain communities. The man they had mocked for wasting 8 months carving stone had created the only truly warm shelter within a day's travel. His innovation had proven undeniably superior in exactly the kind of crisis that revealed all traditional methods to be inadequate. Caleb Drummond arrived at Owen's Ridge in late January. He offered no apology for his previous ridicule but instead asked detailed questions. How deep had Owen carved? What tools had he used? How did the ventilation system work? Owen answered everything fully and offered to show Caleb the interior again. Caleb spent an hour examining the carved chamber, touching the rock walls, studying the hearth placement, and inquiring about thermal mass and heat retention. Over the following months, other mountaineers began attempting similar excavations. Some succeeded in creating smaller versions of Owen's design. Others lacked the patience or encountered stone that was too hard to carve with the available tools. But the principle had been demonstrated, and its value was clear. Owen helped several families select suitable cliff faces and advised them on excavation techniques. He shared what he had learned about finding natural fracture planes in the limestone and the optimal dimensions for ventilation channels, asking nothing in return. Sarah Fletcher visited in the spring with Emma, bringing Owen a quilt she had sewn as thanks for saving their lives. The girl had recovered completely and spent an hour exploring the carved chamber with obvious fascination. She asked Owen if he had been scared while carving into the mountain alone. Owen considered the question thoughtfully before replying that he had been more scared of freezing, like Isaac had. Owen Harlan died in 1907 at the age of 52. He was found in his carved chamber, seated near the cold hearth, having passed peacefully in his sleep. The interior remained exactly as he had maintained it for over 2 decades, clean, organized, and still warmer than the outside air despite the absence of a fire. Having been warmed for days, the rock had retained its temperature even after Owen's death. The carved chamber stood for decades afterward as silent testimony that working with the mountain, rather than merely on top of it, had been the answer all along.